He walked into the courtroom like a forgotten old man fighting only for a shred of dignity. But the moment the judge looked up and whispered, "It's him," the air froze and every soul inside felt the weight of something bigger than justice. That single breathless second turned an ordinary hearing into a storm no one saw coming, a revelation that would tear open secrets buried for decades. Why did the judge recognize him, and what truth was about to erupt in front of everyone? Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from before the next twist unfolds. The cabin sat deep in the timberland, a wooden heart beating quietly among endless pines, and every creak of its floorboards told the story of his family. He moved slowly that morning, his boots pressing into soil his father and grandfather had worked with their bare hands, each step pulling memories to the surface. At 68, his body carried the weight of years, but his mind still drew sharp maps of every tree line and ridge. He could point to the exact spot where he built a rope swing for his son, where he carved initials into bark with the woman who later became his wife, and where storms had once torn through only for him to rebuild stronger. The forest was not just land. It was a cathedral that whispered to him in the mist. Inside the cabin, he ran his hand over Catherine's old recipe box, a battered tin that held more than just instructions for stews and pies. Behind it, tucked as though meant for him to find at this exact moment, lay a manila folder filled with her forest management notes. She had written them in a looping hand, each line, steady, deliberate, carrying the same quiet confidence she had in life. Her final entry stopped him cold. Alexander's gentle stewardship has created something beautiful here. This land will be safe in his hands for generations to come. He stood frozen, staring at the words until his eyes blurred. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, as if she had left a piece of herself behind to steady him. He could still see her sitting on the porch with a wool blanket over her shoulders, sipping coffee as dawn burned through the tree line. She always believed the forest was a circle, that what one gave would come back in some unexpected form. He remembered how she laughed when he tried to fix the screen door with bent nails, how she pressed his calloused hand when he signed the first timber agreement that balanced profit with preservation. She had insisted they leave the old growth alone, arguing the forest was not just theirs to profit from, but theirs to protect. He could still hear her voice in the wind, a low murmur that seemed to rise whenever he doubted himself. The forest gave him memories in fragments, his son as a boy running down the path with mud splattered up his jeans, the slam of the cabin door after a teenage argument that seemed important at the time, but now felt small. Catherine humming as she kneaded bread, her hair catching golden light like fire. Those recollections pressed against him like ghosts, both comforting and cruel. They reminded him of what he had built and what he stood to lose if he let others dictate his worth. That morning the mist clung thick around the cabin, heavy and silver, making the world feel suspended. He brewed coffee in the dented percolator Catherine had refused to replace, its sputter filling the silence. On the wall hung photographs in mismatched frames, his father standing beside a felled spruce, his son in a Little League uniform, holding a bat too heavy for his shoulders. Catherine leaning against the truck with her arms crossed, smiling at him like she knew his every thought. He studied those faces as if they might vanish. He felt both pride and grief, a pride that he had carried their legacy, a grief that time was stripping him piece by piece. The timberland outside was alive with sound ravens calling, branches cracking under the weight of damp air, a river rushing somewhere unseen. He opened the window and let the air in cold enough to bite. The smell of pine was sharp, bracing, and it filled his lungs with a kind of courage. For 3 generations his family had kept this land thriving. He had marked its borders, fought off developers, and resisted offers that would have lined his pockets but destroyed the balance Catherine cared about. He could recall heated nights when she urged him to refuse contracts that seemed lucrative but demanded too much clear-cutting. She was always right. The trees still stood tall because of her stubbornness, and now her notes reminded him that she had trusted him to continue the fight. He walked outside with his coffee steam curling against the chill. The cabin's porch boards sagged but held firm like his own body. He sat in the chair that had been hers, the one angled perfectly to watch the sun slide across the ridges. The chair creaked beneath him, a sound so familiar it was like an embrace. He stared at the trail cutting into the woods, the one his son had once taken with a fishing pole slung over his shoulder, before time and distance turned affection into silence. He wondered if his boy remembered those mornings, if any of it still mattered to him. Catherine's words lingered like a command, safe in his hands for generations to come. Generations, he thought bitterly. His son had not walked these paths in years, yet here he was suddenly concerned about management and memory, suddenly echoing the words of others rather than his own judgment. The sting of betrayal pressed sharp against the warmth of Catherine's faith. He wanted to believe her trust was not misplaced, that he could still carry her vision. But the lines between love, loyalty, and manipulation were blurring. The mist lifted slowly, revealing the jagged outline of the ridge beyond the tree line, and he felt a pulse of determination in his chest. He had weathered storms before, logging disputes, fire seasons, and economic downturns. He had rebuilt fences, roofs, and lives. He could endure this, too. He pressed his fingers against the folder of Catherine's notes and whispered to the empty cabin that he would not let her legacy die. He had carried her through his grief, and now she would carry him through his trial. As the day stretched, he returned to his desk, its surface covered in ledgers and maps. He traced his hand over the ink lines he had drawn himself, decades of boundaries and timber estimates. He was not confused. He was not frail. He was a man who had built something from nothing and held it with steady hands. If they thought they could paint him as weak, they had misjudged the depth of his roots. He closed the folder and looked out at the endless green. Somewhere in that forest was the strength he needed, and he would draw it until the last breath left him. The cabin door rattled slightly under a gust of wind, as if the forest itself was knocking, warning him that the peace he clung to was already cracking. He knew what was coming. The hints had been laid in smiles too sharp, in visits too convenient, in questions that cut deeper than they seemed. He sat back in Catherine's chair and let the forest steady him one last time before the storm arrived. Because it was not just trees and soil they were after. It was his name, his legacy, his very right to stand on the land his family had defended for generations. And what none of them knew not yet was that the circle Catherine had believed in was already turning, carrying with it a truth that would shake every lie to its core. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness outside, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of the forest. He set his coffee down, listening as the low hum of an expensive engine drew closer. Moments later, a sleek black SUV rolled into view, its polished surface glaring against the rough timbers and moss-streaked stones of the cabin. From the driver's seat stepped David Carter, his son's new father-in-law, dressed as if the wilderness were a boardroom-tailored suit, pressed shoes, gleaming hair sculpted to perfection. The contrast was jarring, almost insulting, and the old man felt a prickle run down his spine. Men like David didn't wander into the woods without an agenda. David approached with that same smile he wore at the wedding reception, a smile too wide, too deliberate, a smile that never reached his eyes. He carried a leather briefcase, of course, though there was no need for it here. No contracts waiting to be signed on the porch of a timber cabin. The old man watched from the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame, not yet inviting him in. "Morning," David said, his tone smooth, practiced. "Hope I'm not interrupting. I was in the area and thought I'd check on you. Your son's been worried." The words landed oddly, like a stone dropped into still water. His son had said nothing about worry the last time they spoke. Their conversation had been brief, practical, not warm, but not laced with concern either. The old man narrowed his eyes, wondering whose worry David was really carrying. David's gaze slid across the cabin, sweeping like an appraiser's, noting the age of the wood, the worn chairs, the stacks of ledgers on the desk. His smile tightened. "You've been out here a long time. It's admirable. But I can see how the isolation might take a toll." He let the words hang in the air, casual on the surface, barbed underneath. The old man stepped aside and motioned him in, though unease coiled in his gut. He poured coffee, the bitter scent filling the room, and set a mug on the table. David didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, the picture of polished confidence. "Your son mentioned you've been forgetting things," he said, almost gently, almost like a doctor delivering bad news. "Little lapses, hesitations. We all get older, don't we?" The old man's hand tightened around his own cup. Forgetting things. He thought of the timber contracts he had signed just weeks ago. Every clause scrutinized, every figure exact. He thought of the maintenance schedules mapped out in his careful handwriting, the records that stretched back decades with no gaps, no mistakes. Forgetting things. The suggestion was absurd, insulting, but spoken in such a mild tone it was meant to sound reasonable. He studied David across the table, noting the calculated ease in his movements, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes when he thought he'd planted a seed of doubt. There was a rhythm to it, a performance honed through years of negotiations, of pushing people toward outcomes they hadn't chosen. "You're mistaken," the old man said evenly. "My mind is sharp. The forest keeps me sharp." David chuckled softly as if humoring a child. Of course. But timber prices are volatile right now. Some of these old-growth sections could be worth a fortune if managed differently. You wouldn't want to miss opportunities. Your son only wants what's best for you." The words struck deeper than the earlier insinuations. They weren't about memory anymore. They were about the land, the very bones of his life. And suddenly the picture sharpened. David hadn't come to check on his health. He'd come to probe, to test the waters, to see how far he could push. The old man's pulse thudded in his temples. He thought of Catherine's notes still open on the desk, her words about stewardship and legacy. He thought of his son drawn into David's orbit, listening to his polished voice, mistaking manipulation for wisdom. And he realized the battle wasn't just about dignity anymore. It was about control of everything his family had built. David leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. Sometimes it helps to have an expert evaluation. Just routine, nothing serious. A checkup to reassure everyone. I know a doctor highly recommended discreet. Wouldn't hurt to get it on paper, would it? The old man met his eyes, searching for any trace of sincerity, and finding none. He saw only ambition cloaked in courtesy. Hunger hidden behind civility. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, a steady rhythm that masked the tension coiling through his chest. He thought of his son as a boy, mud on his jeans, laughter in his throat, a fishing pole too long for his small hands. He thought of how easily that boy had once trusted him, how quickly he had obeyed when told not to stray from the path. And now, years later, that same son seemed blind to the path David was laying out, a path that led not to safety, but to ruin. The cabin felt smaller with David inside it, the air heavier, the silence between words weighted with menace. The old man forced a calm smile, the kind people mistook for compliance, though every nerve inside him burned. He sipped his coffee, let the bitterness steady him, and nodded as if considering the suggestion. David's eyes gleamed, catching that faint flicker of agreement, mistaking it for surrender. He pulled out his phone, his fingers already dialing. "Excellent," he said. "I'll set it up. Sooner the better. These things are always easier when handled promptly." The old man turned his gaze to the window, to the towering pines beyond their trunks, straight and unyielding. Catherine had always said the forest was full of circles, that what one gave would return. He wondered what circle he had just stepped into. What storm was about to break? The chill in his bones told him this was no casual visit, no harmless concern. As David spoke into his phone, voice smooth and certain, the old man realized he was staring not at a concerned relative but at a predator in polished shoes, a man who had come to take everything while pretending to offer help. And though he nodded, though he stayed silent, a spark lit deep inside him, the spark of someone who would not be erased so easily. Outside, the mist began to lift, sunlight breaking through in fractured beams, cutting across the forest floor like blades. It was as if the land itself was warning him, showing him the sharp edge hidden beneath the surface. He knew then that the test had begun, and the next move would decide whether he remained master of his legacy or became another casualty of someone else's ambition. What he didn't know not yet was just how carefully the trap had been built and how far David was willing to go to spring it. The phone clicked shut in David Carter's hand with the finality of a verdict, and the silence that followed was heavier than the timber beams holding up the roof. The old man sat across from him, his coffee cooling in the cup, the steam long gone. He kept his face composed, but inside every instinct screamed against what had just happened. A medical evaluation. Harmless on the surface, David had said. Just routine. Something to ease concerns, a little paperwork to settle everyone's nerves. But he had been alive too long, seen too many deals dressed in fine language to miss the sharp hook hidden under that soft bait. Still the image of his son's face pressed down on him. His boy, once small enough to ride on his shoulders, now standing in another man's shadow, repeating words that didn't sound like his own. The thought gnawed at him. If agreeing to this test meant restoring his son's peace of mind, could it really be so dangerous? Yet the knot in his gut told him otherwise. David leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from every angle of his polished frame. "You'll see," he said smoothly. "It's better this way. Everyone sleeps easier when there's a professional opinion. And if everything comes back fine, well, then you'll have nothing to worry about." His tone carried that practiced mix of concern and authority, a salesman's voice perfected over years of bending people toward outcomes they never intended to choose. The old man gave a slow nod, one that felt like betrayal of himself. It wasn't surrender, not truly, but a concession to the bond of blood. For his son, he told himself. Only for his son. Catherine's voice whispered in the back of his mind, sharp as a pine needle, "Don't let them mistake silence for weakness." But it was too late. David had the answer he came for. The days that followed stretched like wire pulled taut. Letters arrived confirming the appointment, a neat envelope with clinical lettering that smelled of ink and inevitability. His son called once, awkward and brief, repeating the same words David had used. "It's just to make sure you're okay, Dad." The old man heard the unease in his tone, the hesitation that suggested even he wasn't entirely convinced. Yet the fact that he spoke David's words at all cut deeper than he let on. At night the cabin felt different, as though shadows lingered longer in the corners. He would sit by the desk, Catherine's notes spread before him, running his hand over the familiar ink, trying to anchor himself to something steady. But doubt crept in. Was his mind truly as sharp as he believed? He replayed conversations, checked his records, reread contracts. Everything held, every figure balanced, every clause airtight. Still he caught himself second-guessing. That was the cruelty of David's suggestion, not in its truth, but in how it forced him to question what he knew was solid. On the morning of the appointment, the forest seemed to withhold its comfort. The mist didn't feel like a blanket, but a veil obscuring his path. He dressed with care, pulling on his best shirt, the one Catherine had ironed for him when she was alive, its fabric stiff with age but smelling faintly of cedar. He wanted to walk into that office not as a man diminished, but as the steward of generations. David arrived to drive him, of course. He slid behind the wheel of the SUV, hands resting casually on the leather eyes hidden behind expensive sunglasses. The old man sat in the passenger seat, silent, watching the trees blur past. Every turn of the road carried him farther from the world he knew and deeper into territory chosen by someone else. The hum of the tires was relentless, a reminder that he was no longer in control. The clinic sat sterile against the city skyline, all glass and steel, a place designed to strip away individuality. Inside, the air reeked of disinfectant, too clean, too artificial. A receptionist smiled with rehearsed warmth as she handed over forms already filled out with his name, his age, his address. He noticed David's signature scrawled in places he hadn't signed himself. When his son entered the waiting room, it was like catching sight of a ghost. He hadn't expected him there, hadn't dared hope. The boy fidgeted with his phone, avoiding eye contact, caught between loyalty to his father and the influence of his new family. The old man wanted to reach out to shake him by the shoulders to remind him of fishing trips and long hikes and lessons learned under these very trees. But the words lodged in his throat. The gulf between them felt wider than the Cascade ridges. A nurse called his name, her voice brisk and impersonal. He rose, feeling the weight of eyes on him. David's hand clapped his shoulder lightly, a gesture meant to look supportive but heavy with possession. His son stood silent, his face pale. The hallway was narrow, lined with motivational posters about healthy aging that felt like mockery. Each step carried him closer to the trap, closer to a judgment that could unravel everything he had built. Inside the office, Dr. Henry Wallace waited, thin and nervous, shuffling papers like a man rehearsing lines. His eyes darted quickly toward David, then back down, a glance that told the old man everything. This was no impartial test. The script had already been written. He sat spine straight, eyes steady, determined to answer every question with clarity. Numbers, words, drawings, he handled them all, each response precise. Yet every time he paused to think, Wallace marked it down, every request for clarification twisted into a sign of confusion. The old man felt the walls tightening, the game closing in. He realized then that agreeing to this test had been more than a concession. It had been an opening for wolves to step inside. Still he endured. For his son. For Catherine's legacy. For the land that carried their name. When the session ended, Wallace offered a smile too grim to be kind and muttered something about concerns that would need further attention. The words dropped like stones, heavy and deliberate. As he walked back into the waiting room, he saw David's face light with quiet triumph, saw his son's confusion deepen. He said nothing. He let silence wrap around him like armor, though his hands trembled faintly as he reached for his coat. Outside, the air felt sharp, metallic, as if the city itself had cut into his lungs. He knew the report would not reflect truth but manipulation. He knew the fight had only just begun. Yet beneath the dread, a flicker of resolve hardened. They thought they had trapped him, thought his signature on a single form meant surrender. But they had underestimated the strength of roots buried deep in soil and memory. The SUV door shut with a hollow thud, sealing him inside once more. David hummed lightly as he drove, a man satisfied with progress, blind to the storm building quietly beside him. The old man turned his gaze toward the horizon, the forest line faint in the distance. That land was still his, still waiting. And he knew that before this was over, the very ground David sought to claim would rise against him. What none of them realized not yet was that the forest kept its own ledger, and every betrayal carved a debt that would one day be collected. The room was white, too white, a place stripped of warmth, built to make anyone who entered feel smaller. The old man sat rigid in the chair across from Dr. Henry Wallace, watching the way the man shuffled papers as if they were more important than the person in front of him. The doctor's pen clicked twice, his eyes darting toward the doorway where David Carter lingered with false patience. That glance told the truth. Before a single question was asked, the verdict had already been written. Mr. Caldwell Wallace began, voice thin, polite but cold. This will be simple. Just routine questions to evaluate your cognitive abilities. The old man nodded, determined to give no ground. He had built contracts out of nothing, had debated timber rights with men twice as ruthless as this, had memorized every ridge and gully of 5,000 acres of land. His mind was sharp, sharper than Wallace's smug little notes. Repeat these 3 words. Apple penny table, Wallace said. Apple penny table, he answered instantly. Wallace scribbled something anyway, his face a mask of professional concern. Count backward from 100 by 7s. 93, 86, 79, 72, 65. The numbers rolled off his tongue with the ease of long practice. He had taught his son arithmetic on the porch one summer, using exactly this trick, numbers falling like timber cut in rhythm. But Wallace's pen moved quickly, too quickly, his eyes narrowing as if every answer carried failure. Draw a clock face, Wallace said, sliding a paper toward him. He sketched with steady lines numbers spaced precisely, hands set at 11:10. The drawing was neat, exact, the work of a man who had drafted maps and diagrams for decades. Wallace tapped his pen against the paper, frowning. Your proportions are slightly uneven. That may indicate some spatial disorientation. Uneven. The man had drawn the clock perfectly. The old man clenched his jaw, fury pressing hard against his ribs, but he said nothing. What year is it? Wallace asked. 2024. Another note, another frown. Who is the current president? He gave the correct answer without hesitation. Wallace sighed quietly as if disappointed, then wrote more. Each question came like a hammer strike, but the weight wasn't in the question itself. It was in the way Wallace twisted every pause, every detail, into proof of decline. When the old man paused briefly to recall a headline from last week, Wallace clicked his watch, dramatically timing him, then scribbled delayed response on his pad. When he asked for clarification on a question deliberately vague, Wallace shook his head and wrote confusion regarding instructions. 3 animals that start with S. Snake, squirrel, salmon. He spoke without hesitation. Wallace looked down at his notes and said, You rely heavily on forest-related examples. That may indicate narrowing of cognitive flexibility. The absurdity nearly made him laugh, but there was nothing funny about the trap tightening around him. He could see David through the half-open door, arms crossed, leaning casually against the frame with a faint smile tugging at his mouth. He wasn't worried. Why should he be? The show was going exactly as scripted. The old man's heart pounded not with fear of the questions, but with rage at the manipulation. He answered everyone clear and correct, but Wallace treated truth like smoke, twisting it until it resembled weakness. By the time the exam ended, the air in the room felt poisonous. Wallace set his pen down with deliberate gravity. Mr. Caldwell, he said in a voice soaked with false sympathy, you performed adequately on many tasks, but there are concerning patterns, delayed responses, rigidity in thought, difficulty with abstraction. These could be early indicators of cognitive decline. The words struck like a blow, though he had expected them. He had seen the bias etched into every line of Wallace's face from the start. Still, hearing them spoken aloud carried a weight heavier than he had imagined. He sat motionless, staring at the man who had just tried to erase decades of sharp judgment with a handful of false notes. A lifetime of stewardship of decisions that had kept both land and family alive, reduced to a few sentences spoken by a stranger who had already chosen which side to serve. We'll be filing a report with Adult Protective Services. Wallace added, his tone now laced with the finality of authority. It's standard procedure in cases like this. Standard procedure. The phrase twisted in the old man's chest like a knife. To be labeled as incapable, to have strangers step into the space where his judgment had stood unchallenged for years, it was more than insult. It was an attempt to strip him of his identity, his freedom, his very right to stand on the soil he had protected all his life. Through the doorway he saw his son, eyes wide with confusion, lips parting as though to protest. But David was quicker, slipping an arm around the boy's shoulders, pulling him close, whispering something he couldn't hear. The hesitation in his son's face told him enough. The boy had seen the truth inside that room, but was being smothered by David's confidence. The old man rose slowly, his chair scraping against the sterile floor. He adjusted his coat movements, deliberate, refusing to show weakness. Wallace looked at him with a practiced mixture of pity and superiority, as if he were already just another case file. Outside, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. His son met his eyes, confusion flickering there like a trapped bird. The boy whispered, "Dad, you answered everything right." "I don't understand." David cut in smoothly, his voice low but firm. "We're not doctors. Dr. Wallace knows what to look for. This is for the best." The old man felt the fury rise sharp and hot, but he pressed it down. Anger was what they wanted, a crack they could exploit. Instead, he gave a faint smile, the same smile that had unnerved rivals across negotiation tables for 40 years. The kind of smile that promised silence now, but retaliation later. As they walked out into the daylight, the city air hit him like metal, cold and unyielding. He could almost hear the forest in the back of his mind, its whispers reminding him that storms were always followed by regrowth. They thought they had weakened him with a false diagnosis, but they had underestimated the patience of a man who had spent his life listening to trees grow. David opened the SUV door with a flourish, gesturing him inside like a host welcoming a guest. The old man stepped in without a word, his silence a weapon sharper than any outburst. The car pulled away from the curb, the clinic shrinking in the rearview mirror. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, not on the smug reflection of David in the glass. The report would come soon, and with it the official stamp of doubt, the first strike in a larger plan. He knew then, as the engine hummed and the city fell behind, that the game had shifted. He was no longer defending just his dignity, he was defending his freedom, his legacy, his very name. And the trap David believed was closing would soon reveal its own cracks, because every scheme, no matter how carefully laid, carries within it the seed of its own destruction. What none of them expected, not David, not Wallace, not even his uncertain son, was how quickly that seed was about to grow. The envelope arrived 3 days later, slid under his cabin door with the weight of something final. The seal was stamped with the insignia of the county office, and even before he tore it open, he knew what it carried. The paper inside was thin, clinical, but the words cut like steel. Cognitive decline, potential incapacity, recommendation for oversight. A single report signed by Dr. Henry Wallace now carried the power to erase decades of judgment, experience, and dignity. He read it once, twice, 3 times, forcing his eyes to stay steady on the page. Each line twisted the truth he had spoken into weakness, every pause described as confusion, every correct answer undermined with clinical doubt. The lies were neat, professional, written in ink that pretended to be impartial. But he knew the smell of corruption. He had fought corporations that tried to clear-cut his forest, seen contracts poisoned with fine print, and battled men who smiled while they stripped you bare. This was no different, only now the battlefield was his mind, and the enemy wore the mask of concern. The letter did not stop there. Attached was a notice from Adult Protective Services. They were opening a case, assigning a social worker, and scheduling a visit. Words like vulnerable adult and guardianship jumped out in bold type, reducing him to a ward before he had even spoken. His throat tightened, his hands trembling not with fear but with rage so sharp it nearly made him dizzy. He had walked through wildfires, rebuilt fences in snowstorms, stood in courtrooms against powerful companies, and never once flinched. But this betrayal, cloaked as protection, struck deeper than anything else. When his son arrived later that evening, the boy's face carried unease, his voice stumbling as he tried to explain. "Dad, they just want to make sure you're okay. That's all this is." The old man stared at him, searching his son's eyes for the truth, but all he found was doubt planted by another's hand. "You think I need strangers to tell me whether I can stand on my own 2 feet?" he asked quietly, the words laced with disappointment, heavier than anger. His son shifted, unable to meet his gaze, mumbling about David, about caution, about safety. It was then the old man understood the depth of the betrayal. His son had not written the report, had not signed the orders, but he had allowed it. He had stood silent while another man's voice decided his father's fate. That night he sat alone on the porch, the forest stretching wide and indifferent around him. The crickets hummed, the pines whispered in the wind, but their comfort felt distant. Catherine's chair sat empty beside him, her absence heavier than ever. He imagined what she would say if she were here, how her voice would cut through the fog of doubt. She would not have trusted men like David. She would not have allowed outsiders to dictate their lives. He pressed a hand to the wooden armrest, feeling the grooves she had worn into it over years, and he swore quietly to her memory that he would not let them strip him of everything. The next morning a county worker arrived, clipboard in hand, her tone polite but firm. She asked questions as though he were already incompetent, peering around the cabin as if expecting to find chaos. He showed her ledgers stacked in ordered timber schedules, precise to the week, maps annotated with a steady hand. But she only nodded, jotting notes that meant nothing. Her smile was thin, her eyes already certain. She left promising follow-up visits, her words smooth but her meaning clear. They had no intention of letting him walk free of this web. The old man felt the circle close. It was not just Wallace. Not just David. It was a system, one that fed on signatures and suspicions, one that could swallow a man whole without ever laying a hand on him. He thought of his father, who had fought off railroad companies with nothing but grit and law, who had stood before judges and refused to surrender his land. He thought of the generations buried beneath the soil, men and women who had carried this forest on their backs. And he realized with a cold clarity that the real battle had only begun. At supper, his son returned torn and restless. "Dad, maybe it's not as bad as it seems. Maybe this will just prove them wrong." The old man studied him, the boy he had once taught to fish in these very streams, now speaking with the hesitation of someone caught between love and influence. He saw the way David's words had wrapped around him, how the promise of security had dulled his instincts. The disappointment settled in like ash, bitter and suffocating. "You think I'm weak," he said flatly. His son shook his head too quickly, but the silence that followed betrayed him. The pain was sharper than any knife. It was not Wallace's report that hurt most, nor the county's intrusion. It was the look in his son's eyes, the flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, his father was no longer the man he once was. Betrayal did not always come in shouting or violence. Sometimes it came in doubt, in the quiet surrender of trust. He lay awake long after the cabin went dark, staring at the ceiling beams that had held through storms and winters. His chest ached, but not from age. It ached from the weight of Catherine's trust, from the memory of her words, that this land would be safe in his hands. How could it be safe if those hands were bound by lies? He closed his eyes and let the forest speak to him in the rustle of leaves and the low groan of branches. The trees had stood for centuries. They had seen betrayal and fire before. They had always endured. By dawn he rose, his body weary, but his mind sharpened by fury. He gathered his ledgers, his maps, Catherine's notes. He placed them carefully on the table, a wall of proof against the falsehoods written in Wallace's report. The battle would not be won with rage. It would be won with precision, with patience, with the same quiet strength that had built this forest into what it was. As the sun broke through the mist, spilling gold across the ridges, he felt the stirrings of resolve stronger than grief. They thought they had cornered him, stripped him of authority and chained him to their paperwork. But they had forgotten one thing. He was not a man who yielded to traps. He was a man who studied them, who waited for the right moment, and who turned them back on those who set them. He looked toward the horizon where the forest stretched endless and unbroken. The fight was coming closer with every breath, and when it arrived, the truth hidden beneath their lies would erupt with a force none of them were prepared to face. The days after the county's intrusion felt like walking through fog, each step uncertain, every sound distorted. He moved carefully, not because his body was failing him, but because every gesture was being watched, measured, recorded by people who had already decided he was broken. Yet in the middle of that suffocating scrutiny came a call that cracked the haze. A voice introduced itself over the line, calm but firm, carrying none of the hollow courtesy he had grown used to. Dr. Linda Harris, an independent neurologist, had been requested to conduct a second evaluation. The old man didn't know whether to laugh or curse another test, another stranger armed with questions, but something in her tone steadied him. She spoke without condescension, without the false warmth of someone delivering bad news. She sounded like a woman who dealt in truth, not manipulation. When she arrived at the cabin, she did not sweep her eyes over the furniture like an appraiser, or comment on the isolation as if it were a symptom. She shook his hand firmly, introduced herself plainly, and asked where they could sit. He gestured to Catherine's old chair on the porch, half expecting her to dismiss it for a desk and clipboard, but she accepted without hesitation, settling into the creak of wood as though she had come to visit, not to interrogate. Her questions were sharp but fair, her observations steady, her pen moving only when necessary. She asked him about his land, about contracts he had signed decades ago, about the changes in timber markets across the years. He spoke easily, fluently, every fact and figure falling into place. She didn't interrupt. She let him finish. When she asked him to recall a sequence of numbers, he delivered them back without pause. When she asked him to draw, he sketched the property lines of his land instead of a clock, explaining soil variations and water routes as though teaching a lesson. She listened, her eyes intent, and when she finally smiled, it wasn't pity. It was recognition. "You're not just capable," she said quietly, closing her notebook. "You're precise. Sharp. Frankly, sharper than most men 20 years younger." The words hit him harder than he expected. After weeks of insinuations, after the suffocating weight of Wallace's false report, hearing truth spoken plainly was like drawing breath after nearly drowning. He nodded once, hiding the sting in his eyes, but inside something long dormant stirred awake. Hope. Daniel had arrived halfway through the session late and hesitant, his face tight with uncertainty. He lingered on the edge of the porch, arms folded, eyes flicking between his father and Dr. Harris. He had expected, perhaps even braced himself to hear hesitation, confusion, the faltering signs David had promised. But instead he watched his father lay out dates, numbers, and facts with the same steady cadence he remembered from childhood. He watched Dr. Harris listen, not dismiss, not twist, but actually listen. And doubt began to carve its way through the foundation David had built. When Harris finished her evaluation, she stood, extending her hand once more. "I'll file my report with the county," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority. "But I'll tell you now, there is no evidence of cognitive decline. None. They will not be able to use this against you." Daniel flinched at the firmness of her words, as if hearing an unshakable truth after weeks of whispers. He looked at his father, really looked, and saw not a frail old man clinging to the past, but the same figure who had once carried him across a river, who had taught him to read the rings of a tree, who had explained the meaning of stewardship with patience and gravity. Shame flickered across his face, but alongside it came something else. Suspicion not of his father, but of David. That evening Daniel stayed at the cabin, lingering longer than he had in years. He asked questions, small at first, about the land, about the records, about the contracts his father kept stacked in careful order. The old man answered simply, without bitterness, but he watched the boy's eyes shift with every response. Seeds of doubt grew into roots of realization. Daniel remembered conversations with David that had felt slightly too smooth, advice delivered too quickly, reassurances that had always served David's interests more than anyone else's. He began to connect the threads, and with each connection came the weight of guilt. The old man didn't press him. He let silence do the work, let the forest speak through the groan of branches and the hum of insects. Finally Daniel broke, his voice low. "I should have questioned him. I should have questioned everything." The old man studied him carefully, the son he had once thought lost to another man's orbit. He said nothing cruel, nothing sharp. He simply replied, "Now you are questioning." It was enough. Later that night, when Daniel left, he lingered at the door, glancing back as if reluctant to go. The old man watched him disappear into the darkness, a flicker of hope warming him against the chill. For the first time in months, he felt he was no longer entirely alone. The following week, Harris's report arrived crisp and clear. It dismantled Wallace's lies with clinical precision, listing each task performed flawlessly, noting his clarity, his memory, his judgment. It carried no pity, no hedging, just fact. He read it once, twice, and allowed himself a thin smile. The county could not ignore this. They might twist, delay, or challenge, but the truth now had teeth. He folded the paper carefully, placing it beside Catherine's notes, and felt the balance shift. They had tried to brand him incompetent, to strip him of his voice, but now the tide was turning. David's carefully built narrative was cracking, and through those cracks light was breaking in. Yet he knew hope alone was not enough. Reports could be buried, voices silenced, truth twisted again. Harris had given him a weapon, But a weapon unused is as useless as silence. He would need more than her words, more than his son's awakening. He would need to prepare for war, not with fists, but with records, with allies, with the kind of patience only a man who had tended forests for a lifetime could muster. The forest outside swayed in the wind, tall and unbroken. He stared into its depths, feeling the same whisper Catherine had always claimed to hear. Circles. Everything returned. They had struck first with lies and betrayal. Now it was his turn to strike back, and this time the ground itself would be on his side. What none of them knew was how close the reckoning already was, how quickly the seeds of doubt they had planted in his son would bloom into something they could no longer control. The forest was still when he rose at dawn, but the stillness felt different now. It wasn't the quiet of defeat. It was the pause before something broke open. On the table inside the cabin, Harris's report lay beside Catherine's old notes, the edges neat and square, a shield of truth against lies. He had spent years relying on the strength of his own two hands. But this fight demanded more than muscle or memory. It demanded law words wielded like weapons. That was why he called Thomas Blake, the one lawyer he trusted, a man who had stood with him years ago when developers tried to carve highways through his land. Blake was older now, gray around the temples, but his eyes still carried the fire of a man who despised corruption. They met in the cabin's narrow kitchen, papers spread across the table, coffee cooling untouched. Blake's fingers moved quickly over Wallace's report, his expression darkening with every page. "This isn't sloppy work," he said finally. "It's deliberate. He wasn't evaluating you, he was building a case against you." His words carried no surprise, only grim certainty. For days, Blake dug into records, filing requests, pulling threads. The old man waited, pacing the porch, restless as a storm cloud. When Blake returned, he brought a folder thick enough to bend the table. He opened it with care, laying out each document like evidence in a trial. "Wallace received a transfer from Carter's holding company 2 weeks before your exam," Blake said, tapping the page. "Untraceable to most eyes, hidden under consulting fees. But it's there." The old man felt the fury rise hot in his chest. Bribery, blatant and cold. His answers had never mattered, his sharpness never recorded. The outcome had been purchased before he walked through that door. He gripped the edge of the table until the wood creaked, his jaw locked against the rage that threatened to spill out. Blake wasn't finished. He slid another sheet forward, a copy of the guardianship petition. The old man's breath caught as he stared at the signature scrawled across the bottom line. His son's name. But it wasn't his son's hand. He knew the slope of that D, the shape of the L, the way his boy always pressed too hard with a pen. This wasn't it. This was a forgery clean enough to fool strangers, but to a father who had watched his son sign birthday cards and school forms for years, it was an insult. "He didn't sign this," the old man said flatly, his voice carrying more steel than grief. Blake nodded. "I've seen it before. Carter needed your son's consent, so he manufactured it. He's bold, reckless, and certain no one would question him." The old man leaned back, the fury sharpening into resolve. Every doubt that had clouded his son's eyes, every hesitation suddenly made sense. His boy hadn't betrayed him completely. He had been used, manipulated, his very name stolen and weaponized. The betrayal was still bitter, but it carried a new edge now, an edge of clarity. This wasn't just about proving his own competence. This was about dismantling the machinery Carter had built piece by piece. That night he walked the perimeter of his land, the lantern casting long shadows across the pines. He thought of Catherine, of her stubborn faith that circles always closed, that justice came whether men wanted it or not. He felt her presence in the hush of the trees and the firm soil beneath his boots. For the first time since Wallace had spoken his false diagnosis, he believed she might be right. The lies were unraveling, and the truth was clawing its way to the surface. When Daniel came the next morning, the old man laid the forged petition in front of him. His son's face drained of color as his eyes scanned the lines landing on the false signature. He shook his head violently. "I never signed this," he whispered. "I never agreed to this." The old man didn't gloat, didn't lash out. He simply said, "I know." Those 2 words struck deeper than any accusation, pulling Daniel's shame to the surface. The boy sat heavily, burying his face in his hands. "He told me it was just routine. He said it was for your protection. I thought God." I thought his voice broke. The old man placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the touch heavy but steady. "Now you see him," he said. "Now you see what he really is." The fury that had once burned only in his chest now sparked in his son's eyes too. Daniel looked up, his jaw set, his hands trembling. Not with fear, but with rage. "We can stop him," he said. "We have to." Blake returned the following day, the folder thicker, the evidence mounting. Bank statements, falsified notes, witnesses ready to testify about Carter's influence over Wallace. The circle of corruption that had seemed airtight was fraying at every edge. The old man felt the tide turning, felt the weight of inevitability shifting back to his side. But hope carried with it a shadow. The more Carter sensed his grip slipping, the more dangerous he would become. This wasn't a man who conceded. This was a man who built traps, who bought doctors, who forged signatures. And a man like that, when cornered, would not retreat quietly. The old man stood on his porch as night fell, the folder of evidence heavy in his hands. The forest loomed around him, vast and silent, a witness to every secret, every betrayal, every oath. He could feel the storm gathering, not in the sky, but in the lives circling his own. Justice was coming close enough to taste. Yet with it came the promise of a confrontation more dangerous than anything he had faced before. Because men like David Carter did not go down without taking others with them. What the old man didn't know, not yet, was just how deep Carter's claws reached, and how violently he would fight to keep from being dragged into the light. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a war room. Maps and ledgers covered the table, folders stacked in neat towers, witness lists pinned against the walls. The old man moved among them with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime organizing harvest schedules, surveying acres, and cataloging every board foot of timber that left his land. Now those same habits became weapons. Every receipt, every contract, every hand-signed ledger line was another piece of armor against the accusations meant to strip him of his dignity. Thomas Blake sat at the table, glasses low on his nose, flipping through bank statements and notarized documents with an intensity that seemed to burn the paper. His voice was steady, but hard. "They'll try to claim these records are outdated, that you've mismanaged assets. We'll counter with independent audits. I've already contacted 2 firms willing to testify." Daniel sat nearby, his head bent over a stack of old photographs and letters. His hands shook, but not from hesitation. He was angry now, driven. He muttered as he worked, piecing together timelines, pulling names from memories of family gatherings and forestry meetings. "We need people who know him. People who've seen him work, negotiate, run this place. The county won't just take paperwork. They need faces, voices." The old man watched his son, pride and sorrow warring quietly inside him. Daniel had once been content to let another man speak for him, but now his eyes carried the same fire his father had seen in Catherine's. At last his son was standing on his side of the line. Word spread through the valley faster than he expected. Farmers, loggers, neighbors from miles away arrived at the cabin, some with sworn statements, others with stories. A retired teacher brought attendance records showing his precise involvement in land preservation boards. A mill owner arrived with letters detailing negotiations too detailed for a man supposedly in decline. Old friends carried photographs of him leading conservation meetings, speaking with authority, debating details sharp enough to cut steel. The porch filled with voices each evening, men and women offering themselves as witnesses. "I've worked with him 30 years. One man said, his voice rough as bark. "He doesn't forget a thing. He knows this land better than any of us." An older woman added, "He balanced the cooperative's accounts for a decade. If that's confusion, then we all ought to be so confused." Each testimony tightened the net around Carter and Wallace. Each voice gave strength to the old man's cause. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt the weight of support pressing behind him instead of against him. The forest was no longer just his burden to defend. It had become a rallying point, a symbol of defiance shared by all who lived in its shadow. Blake built the case methodically, layer upon layer, ensuring no crack remained for Carter's lies to seep through. Independent doctors reviewed Harris's evaluation and confirmed her findings. Accountants traced funds from Carter's companies into Wallace's accounts. Handwriting experts compared Daniel's real signature to the forgery declaring the petition a fraud. What had begun as a desperate defense was turning into an offensive strike. At night, the old man walked through the woods, lantern swinging the familiar paths, whispering to him. He thought of the generations who had stood here before, each fighting their own battles against men who valued profit over principle. He could almost hear Catherine's laughter on the wind, reminding him that strength was not just in muscle, but in endurance, in patience, in knowing when to strike. Inside, Daniel sat across from Blake, his face lit by lamplight. "What happens if we lose?" he asked quietly. The question hung heavy. Blake didn't look up from his papers. "Then they'll take control. Your father will lose his rights. The land will be managed by Carter, sold piece by piece until nothing remains." His voice hardened. "But we won't lose. We have too much more than they ever expected us to find." The old man placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm. "We fight," he said simply. "We fight with everything we have. No one takes what belongs to us without a war." The final days before the hearing blurred into relentless preparation. Witnesses were prepped, statements, notarized evidence copied and bound. Blake drilled Daniel in testimony, pushing him to speak clearly, to stand firm. The boy stumbled at first, weighed down by guilt for ever doubting his father, but slowly his voice steadied. By the third day, his words cut with conviction, his spine straight, his shame transformed into determination. The community's support did more than provide evidence, it built momentum. Local papers caught wind of the story, framing it as a fight between a respected land steward and a corrupt outsider. Editorials appeared demanding justice, urging the court to see the truth. By the time the hearing date was set, Carter's name was already being whispered in taverns and town halls with disdain. Yet the old man knew better than to trust momentum alone. He had lived long enough to know how power twisted outcomes, how money bent the law. Carter would not walk into that courtroom unarmed. He would arrive polished, prepared, dripping with confidence and the arrogance of a man who believed he could buy fate. The night before the hearing, the cabin was quiet. Blake had gone back to the city to finalize filings. Daniel sat asleep in a chair, exhaustion pulling him under. The old man stood by the window, staring out at the black line of trees against the starlit sky. The forest stood as it always had, silent, enduring, but he felt its weight differently now. It was not just his legacy, it was proof. Proof of his life, his decisions, his clarity. Proof they could not erase with forged signatures and bribed doctors. He pressed his hand against the glass, whispering words only Catherine would understand. Tomorrow. The dawn came cold, the air sharp, every sound amplified in the stillness. The old man, dressed with care, pulling on his best coat, the one Catherine had bought him years ago. He fastened each button slowly, deliberately, as though preparing armor. Daniel stood beside him, tie, crooked eyes, bloodshot but burning with resolve. They stepped onto the porch together, father and son, ready to face what awaited them. The forest loomed behind them like a silent army, every tree a witness. The old man took one last breath of pine-scented air, steadying himself. The courthouse awaited, filled with strangers, ready to weigh his life on scales already bent by corruption. But this time, he would not walk in alone. He carried with him decades of records, the voices of a community, the unwavering support of a lawyer who despised injustice, and the newly sharpened loyalty of a son who had finally seen the truth. And somewhere inside that courthouse, behind polished wood and hollow rituals, David Carter was waiting, certain of victory. What he did not realize was that the old man was no longer simply defending himself. He was preparing to unleash a reckoning that would tear the mask from every face that had conspired against him. The courthouse smelled of varnished wood and old paper, a place where justice was supposed to be blind, but too often saw only money. The old man walked through the doors with his son and Thomas Blake at his side, the steady rhythm of his boots echoing against the marble floor. He felt the weight of every eye that turned his way, some curious, some skeptical, others already judging. He kept his head high, his posture unbroken, carrying the years on his back like armor. David Carter was already there, polished as ever, suit pressed so sharp it could cut. He stood near the plaintiff's table, shaking hands with men who smelled of influence, whispering to Wallace, who looked paler now, as though the mask of confidence no longer fit. Carter caught sight of the old man and smiled, a thin reptilian stretch that spoke not of welcome, but of warning. The courtroom filled quickly. Neighbors, community members, men and women from the cooperative, even local reporters crowded into benches, their voices low anticipation humming in the air. This was more than a hearing now. It had become a spectacle, a battle between legacy and ambition. The bailiff called the room to order, and when the door behind the bench opened, silence fell. Judge Julia Benson entered, robes, flowing, eyes steady as she took her seat. She was a woman in her 60s, hair pulled tight, posture unyielding. She glanced over the docket, then looked up, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, and then her eyes landed on him. For a moment the mask of judicial detachment faltered. She blinked, froze, and her fingers stilled on the papers before her. Recognition rippled through her expression like a shadow passing across sunlight. She looked at him, not as a stranger, not as a defendant, but as someone pulled from memory, someone whose presence cracked open a door to the past. He felt it too, though he couldn't place it immediately. The way her eyes widened, the sharp intake of breath, there was history there buried beneath decades. She recovered quickly, clearing her throat, adjusting her papers, but the tremor lingered. Proceedings began. Carter's attorney spoke first, his words a polished blade framing the old man as vulnerable, confused, incapable of managing affairs. He pointed to Wallace's report, waving it like scripture. The old man sat still, listening, his jaw tight but his eyes never wavering. When Blake rose, his voice was calm but relentless, laying out Harris's evaluation, the audits, the witnesses lined up to testify. Every point was a strike, precise and measured. But it wasn't until the old man himself was called to the stand that the room shifted. He moved with slow dignity, gripping the railing, lowering himself into the witness chair. The oath was spoken, his voice steady as he swore to tell the truth. And then, as he raised his eyes, he met Benson's gaze fully. It hit him then. 30 years ago, a younger Julia Benson had stood trembling in a courtroom much like this, a junior attorney facing down a timber conglomerate accused of poisoning the river. Their lawyers had been sharks circling her, ready to shred her inexperience. He had taken the stand that day, a respected forester, armed with ledgers and maps, testimony precise enough to dismantle lies. He remembered her face, pale but determined, as his words cut through the corporate veil. His testimony had turned the tide, securing not just the case but her career. Now she remembered too. Her lips parted slightly, and for the briefest second, gratitude flickered raw across her face. 30 years had not erased it. As questioning began, Carter's attorney tried to paint him as confused, pressing him with dates and figures. But the old man answered each one with clarity, his voice carrying the resonance of truth. He cited contracts, timber schedules, rainfall measurements from memory, his words as firm as the ridges he had walked for decades. Every time the attorney tried to trip him, he steadied himself, refusing to falter. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, admiration growing with each answer. Blake followed with his own questions, guiding him gently, allowing the truth to unfold without force. He explained his stewardship, his management of finances, his commitment to the land. Each sentence drove another nail into the coffin of Wallace's false report. Wallace himself was called next, his voice shaking as Blake confronted him with the payment transfers, the inconsistencies, the damning evidence of Carter's influence. His denials rang hollow, his eyes darting toward Carter for reassurance that never came. When handwriting experts declared Daniel's signature, forged, the tension in the room snapped. Gasps echoed, whispers surged. Carter's polished veneer cracked, for the first time a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. Through it all, Benson remained composed, but her eyes lingered on the old man longer than was customary. She listened not just with ears trained by law, but with memory shaped by gratitude. She remembered the man who had stood without fear against a machine designed to crush truth. And she saw that same man before her, now aged but unbroken, carrying himself with the same quiet strength. By the time testimonies ended, the air in the courtroom was electric. The gallery leaned forward, breaths held waiting for the balance to tip. Benson looked over the papers, her gavel resting in her hand, but her eyes never left him for long. She saw not just a defendant, but a reminder of the path that had brought her here, a man whose integrity had shaped the course of her life. Her voice cut through the silence, measured, deliberate. This court has heard compelling evidence not just of competence, but of manipulation, forgery, and bribery. The attempt to strip Mr. Caldwell of his rights was not founded in concern, but in deceit. The words reverberated like thunder. Carter's face drained of color. Wallace slumped in his chair, and the gallery erupted in whispers. Benson's eyes met the old man's one final time, and for the smallest heartbeat her expression softened. Gratitude etched deep in the lines of her face. The old man sat motionless, the weight of vindication settling heavy across his shoulders. For weeks they had tried to erase him, to silence him, to make him small. But here in this room where he had once stood for truth decades earlier, justice had found him again. Yet even as relief seeped into his chest, he knew the battle wasn't finished. Carter was cornered now, and men like him didn't accept defeat quietly. Outside these walls, beyond the reach of the gavel, storms still brewed. What no one in that courtroom yet realized was how far Carter was willing to go to keep his empire from collapsing, and how dangerous a man becomes when the mask is finally torn from his face. The gavel struck wood, a sound that sliced through the packed courtroom like an axe splitting a log. Judge Benson's words carried no hesitation, no ambiguity. The petition for guardianship was dismissed with prejudice. More than that, formal charges of fraud, forgery, and bribery were to be filed against David Carter and Dr. Henry Wallace. Gasps rose from the gallery, reporters scribbling furiously, neighbors exchanging looks of shock and vindication. For weeks, whispers had questioned whether the old man had lost his edge, whether he had finally grown too weary to hold the world at bay. Now those same whispers shifted into murmurs of respect, even awe. David's face drained of color, his jaw clenching as though he could hold on to control through sheer will. Wallace slumped in his chair, glasses sliding down his nose, his hands trembling with the weight of his own collapse. They had come into this courtroom sure of victory, wrapped in the arrogance of men who believed money could buy reality. Now they sat, exposed masks torn away, facing a reckoning neither had planned for. The old man did not move at first. He sat still in the witness chair, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The storm of vindication swirled around him, but inside he felt something quieter, something steadier. It was the release of a weight he had carried since the moment Wallace first scribbled his lies onto paper. He inhaled deeply, letting the air fill his lungs, tasting the sharpness of justice delivered. Daniel was on his feet before anyone else, crossing the courtroom in quick strides. His face was flushed, his eyes wet, but his jaw was set with conviction. When he reached his father, he didn't speak at first. He simply placed a hand on his shoulder, fingers gripping tight, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured. The old man turned slightly, meeting his son's gaze, and in that look passed something beyond words, an understanding, a forgiveness, a return. Blake packed his briefcase methodically, his expression unreadable, but when he caught the old man's eye, he allowed himself the smallest nod. It was the nod of a warrior acknowledging another, an unspoken salute to a battle fought clean and won without compromise. As they walked out of the courthouse, flashes from cameras lit the steps, reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward. The old man ignored them, his stride steady, his son beside him. The crowd parted as though recognizing the dignity of someone who had weathered more than most could imagine. He didn't need to explain himself. The truth was written in the verdict, carved into the fall of Carter and Wallace. Outside, the sky had cleared, a bright stretch of blue arching over the town. For the first time in months he lifted his head fully and let the sun warm his face. The forest waited beyond the horizon, tall and unbroken, its ridges steady against the skyline. That land was still his, still protected, still alive with the legacy Catherine had entrusted to him. In the days that followed, the community rallied not just in celebration, but in defense. Neighbors brought food, offered help repairing fences, volunteered to assist with upcoming harvest schedules. Letters arrived from men and women he had helped over decades, each one thanking him for standing firm, for reminding them that justice was not dead. Even those who had doubted him now spoke his name with respect, shaking their heads at the audacity of Carter's scheme. Daniel remained close, spending nights at the cabin, walking the ridges with his father at dawn, listening more than he spoke. Guilt lingered in his eyes, but so did determination. He asked questions about the land, about the ledgers, about the lessons Catherine had once taught them both. Slowly, carefully, the distance between father and son began to close. Around the fire at night they spoke of memories not as wounds, but as bonds reforged. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, then freer, echoing through the old wood beams of the cabin. The old man felt Catherine there with them, in the creak of her chair on the porch, in the hush of the pines swaying outside. He could almost hear her whisper, see her smile in the flicker of firelight. She had trusted him to guard their legacy, and he had done so. More than that, he had protected their family's name, ensured that their son would see truth for himself. News of Carter's fall spread quickly. His companies bled contracts, investors withdrew, his reputation shredded in a matter of weeks. Wallace's license was suspended pending investigation, his career collapsing under the weight of exposed corruption. Their power had seemed untouchable, but once cracks appeared, the whole edifice came crashing down. For the old man, victory was not in their ruin, but in the restoration of what mattered: his name, his autonomy, his bond with his son, his place in the circle Catherine had always spoken of. He felt lighter now, his steps surer, his gaze clearer. Not because he had proven himself capable, he had never doubted that, but because others could no longer deny it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in crimson and gold, he sat on the porch with Daniel at his side. The forest hummed with life, cicadas rising in chorus, a hawk circling high above. Daniel broke the silence softly. "You never stopped believing, did you?" The old man smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "Belief is easy. It's patience that's hard." They sat in silence, father and son, the weight of months of betrayal and battle settling into memory. The forest loomed steady, eternal, its trees a living testament to endurance. The old man felt peace ripple through him, not the fragile peace of surrender, but the solid peace of a man who had fought, endured, and prevailed. Justice had not come easily. It never did. But it had come. And in its wake something even stronger rose: trust, regained dignity, restored a family knit back together by fire and steel. The circle Catherine had believed in was whole again. Yet as the stars began to appear faint against the bruised sky, he knew life would not remain quiet forever. The world had a way of testing those who stood their ground. But for now, with his son beside him and his land safe under his watch, he allowed himself the rarest of luxuries. He exhaled long and steady and let the night embrace him, because tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight belonged to victory and to the unshakable truth that some legacies could never be stolen. In the end, this story reminds us that dignity and integrity are not gifts handed down by others, but values we carry within ourselves, even when the world tries to strip them away. No matter how convincing lies may sound, the truth has a way of rising just as the forest stands tall after every storm. For older adults, it speaks to the importance of holding firm to your life's experience, your wisdom, and your right to be heard. Age is not weakness. It is strength earned through decades of struggle, resilience, and love, even when betrayal comes from those closest. Hope and justice can still prevail when we remain steadfast and surround ourselves with people who believe in what is right. Trust your journey, protect your legacy, and remember that patience often carries more power than force. The lesson is clear. Never underestimate your own worth, because the roots you've planted will outlast every attempt to cut them down. If this message touched you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story too.